Hello, I'm Jeff Nodell. It is Friday, December 6th in the morning, and joining us right now is Boyd Pratt. Hi, Boyd.
Hi, Jeff. Thank you so much for having me.
Yeah, Boyd is the president of the Board of Trustees of the San Juan Island Library. And Boyd, your organization has talked about your ears must burn constantly. You guys are talked about the subject of conversation probably every few minutes across the island. And a big conversation was sparked about a week ago, speculating and asking questions about the property that the library owns at Spring and Mullis. Widely discussed that in itself. And the context of the conversation on Facebook was, and that conversation was kind of halted at one point, and they said, go ask the board. So I thought, that sounds like a good invitation now to bring up this subject, because I think scores, if not hundreds of people watched that conversation, and it just was kind of left hanging. So I thought it would be a good chance for us to kind of answer some of those questions and provide a broader context, and who better to talk to than the president of the Board of Trustees. So thank you very much for agreeing to this. We had a little pre-conversation yesterday, so I learned a few things I know we want to share. But let's start with, I guess, let me set up and say that the library is so incredibly important to San Juan Island. I'm working from memory here, is it not one of the two most used per capita libraries among small libraries in the entire state of Washington?
It's certainly among the 10, yes, and we hit the top 10 in a lot of those categories. So,
and
yes,
there's one little old library that beats San Juan Island from time to time, and that's Orcas Island. And this all supports to me the idea that it's just San Juan County is just an incredibly smart place. Is that fair?
I think that's very fair. Yeah, and we, one of the leading indicators is in terms of the interlibrary loan and things like that, and also actual checkouts and circulation and attendance. And I think the statistic was something like 6 out of 10 residents of San Juan Island were card-carrying members of the library. So I think we have great support tremendous. That way.
So a little quick history for someone who, I don't know, just moved to the island or was in a coma for the last few years. You tried to pass a large bond issue, I guess it was, to build this property out, the new property, because the old property is bursting at the seams and has maintenance issues and all kinds of things. And that did not pass. I recall and then there was an election this year to raise the levy lid lift, and that is just for operations. That is not, those dollars are not supposed to in any way go to capital projects like the new site, right? So, and I remember in the campaigning for the levy lid lift that there was some contrition, there was some sense that maybe that bond issue was just too big. It was just outsized for what the island felt it could do. I don't want to paraphrase everything, but am I right so far?
Yes, you are, and I'm happy to give some background, kind of a run up to why that occurred and things
Please,
like that.
Go ahead. Thank you.
Yeah. So let me go way back to, the idea of a public library on the island. We certainly did have public libraries dating back to the 1920s. And one of the major spaces for that was in the 1930s when they built the WPA, under the WPA funds, the town hall, and where the town council actually meets right now, it was the old library. So you would walk up those steps and go in there. And I recall that fiction was on one side and nonfiction on the other, and the librarian was right in the middle there. So, but that the island really kind of outgrew that. And so in 1983, it was proposed that we actually establish a junior taxing district for the San Juan Island Library, the public library. And soon thereafter, the library bought a property, an old restaurant, the Shrimp Boat, and remodeled it into the library. So that was built about 1984. And so that served as the library for a good 10 years, but it soon outgrew its purpose. And so there's an actual levee lid lift back then, and in 1994, they did an addition that doubled the size of the library. So the current size of the library is about 9,800 square feet, so just under 10,000. And so that was the last major remodel, a good 30 years ago. And since then, obviously, the island population has grown, our readership and our actual membership in the library has grown. And so the board of trustees decided in 2018 to really take a serious look at another property, or to examine our current property to see what would occur. What were the possibilities in terms of expanding? And they quickly discovered that in our current location, there were several major restrictions in regard to expanding that. One was the parking lot, which I'm sure many of our viewers are familiar with. I think it's very actually challenging space. And we couldn't expand the building without expanding the parking lot. And so that was not an option. It also proved that structurally it would be very costly to go to a second story. So at that point, the board really started looking at alternate properties in town. One of them was actually next door in the county maintenance lot there. And another was on the Argyle property that is currently being used by the Home Trust in terms of affordable housing. And then the third site was the 660 Spring Street, which is currently owned by the library. They evaluated, through consultants, evaluated those three properties and settled on the Spring Street property as being central to services in the town, to several of the schools in town, and it was just a great location. But I will say that it was the old life care center, and it had been abandoned for 4 years prior to the purchase by the library. And so the buildings themselves were in really terrible condition. And so when it was actually purchased through a limited tax general obligation bond through the library in 2020, we took over the kind of caretaker maintenance of that property itself. A major factor occurred in 2022, I believe, when there was a winter storm, a winter freeze, and we had hired a maintenance worker to monitor the property for 5 days a week. They had actually drained all the water lines to the property itself, but the one water line that was kept was the emergency fire sprinkler system. So in that deep freeze, that burst and caused major damage to the building itself. And I will say we were not alone in the town of Friday Harbor. There was extensive damage. If you ask any of the town residents who were around at that time, there was extensive damage in the town itself. But we did have insurance on it. We filed for a claim. We have gotten various claim money, that property itself. And we have applied that to kind of mitigating the actual damage in the property itself. But now, as it stands, the current facility is basically mothballed and awaiting a new library. Right, so that's kind of a lot of the background. I know you probably have specific questions about what the plans were and things like
so,
that.
The building is going to be raised. It's going to be torn down. Can we be that declarative? Is it that straightforward? The decision was made some time ago?
Yes, and so we the board at the time did their due diligence in regard to these three sites that we were looking at, and specifically that site that we then focused on in terms of the purchase. And they did an analysis of the building, and it proved in terms of the budget-wise that it would be far more expensive to try to modify that existing structure, which was an old life care center, into a library. It would be far more expensive than basically demolishing it and starting.
How soon after the acquisition of the building was it decided that the building would eventually be raised?
I think it was concurrent, actually, because, as I said, it was part of the analysis of the actual site.
So the building was bought with the expectation from the very beginning that it would be torn down. Okay.
Yes.
That may come as news to some people who I don't know if they knew that. And then there is, I'll let you react to this, but again, building on the kind of the Facebook discussion, the building was ruined because of the water break. And do you hear that? Have people said that? Do you pick that up in the community that the building was mismanaged and it could have, should have, would have been adapted and rehabbed and that kind of thing?
Yeah, and I want to give due credit to people who really want to kind of restore existing structures. I'm all for that. But the property, as I said, when we actually bought it, it was at least 4 years old. It had been totally neglected, mothballed, basically. And I don't think you can blame the library district for that damage that occurred. I think it was extraordinary. We were trying to maintain the property as best possible. And so I think it was really extraordinary that way. A lot of people walk by. It's one of the ironies, I think, about our taking care of that property, and it's true of our current facility too. There are many challenges in regard to that being an old building. But Lori Orton, our director, has done just a marvelous job of really maintaining that property well. And so people don't see the challenges of an old property that way. And I think that is true of the new property too. People walk by and they say, well, the exterior looks great. Why don't you use that? That's a perfectly functional building. Well, it's not. It's really, most of the interior has been gutted. And in fact, it's part of the remediation work in regard to the insurance funds. We've taken out all the asbestos, removed all the asbestos that was there. And so it's really in poor shape and not readily, at least not readily rehabilitatable in terms of
so the insurance proceeds actually let you get started in the demo. Is that true? Okay.
Yes. Right. Yeah. Because we would have had to take away that asbestos anyway, and that's a major cost. Yeah.
So is the building going to be torn down before construction for a new building starts, or will that all happen at once?
So we still need to set that up, and I want to take a step back in regard to that. When we purchased this property, it was with, as I said, a limited, what is the full term, limited tax general obligation bond. And that was done in 2020. It was basically a 12-year bond of about a little over $2 million. By taking on that bond, that restricts the board from actually subdividing the property or changing the ownership of the property until it's actually paid off, until we're the full owners of that. So in a lot of ways, that's a restriction in regard to our actual use of the property itself. And so when you get into issues like, could we do affordable housing on the site? Yes, we'd really like to pursue that option and examine that. But we are obligated under the terms of the bond to pay it off and have full ownership before we can proceed with things like that. So the question is, why don't you just tear it down right now and then, wait to build the building? But I think that we really have to use the funds and pay off the property and then proceed with a really considered plan in regard to the new building.
Is that a fundraising campaign for private donations, or is that bundled into another attempt at the bond issue that didn't pass, a smaller one? Where's that $2 million going to come from?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think I want to go back to the bond that failed. And I think that people were very concerned about that tax hit to their taxes in terms of actually doing a new building. It was it was sticker shock, if you will, in terms of the actual amount of it. So they said, we, the people, do not want to fund a public library through a bond that way, or do the majority of it. So I think the board heard that very clearly, and we're seeking different ways to approach it, and with the major way being through private donations. And we're also looking at ways we can do it in terms of a phased process. So not necessarily to do a totally new $12 million structure right off the bat, but to say, can we pay off the property? Can we get a foothold structure on the property that could then be added onto and do a more limited fundraising campaign to look into the funding of that.
Okay, so that sounds pretty important right there. So some key points there that you just raised. You would build in this current concept that I guess you're discussing and deliberating. You would build something much smaller, not even a full library?
Yes. Okay. And I this is all being considered right now. And so but the current thinking is that could we build a part of a structure that could then be added on to the full library? That this partial structure would be an addition basically to our current services over on Guard Street. And it might be something like a 24/7 open lobby with actual places where you could have lock boxes to pick up holds and things like that, and build public meeting space with restrooms, access to restrooms that could then again be rented, actually used through appointment through the library system. That's one of the aspects of our current library. We do have the one meeting room, but it is book solid. And as you probably know, in terms of a lot of the meeting rooms in town, you either pay for them or you go to the library and go to the meeting room and try to take your chances in terms of actually scheduling that. So I think that's a big need. And as I said, there are many ideas being explored right now, and I think we're really in that exploratory phase to see, okay, how can we get to eventually to a full.
Do you do these deliberations in your public open meetings, these conversations?
Yes, absolutely. We currently have a standing item on our agenda that discusses the new property and the possibilities of a new library. And these are open public meetings. We're part of the government process that way. And I also encourage people to look at our website, and on the homepage, if you look under, about the library, it actually has a line about the new library, and it gives all these past studies that have been done, and it tries to keep up in terms of the current discussions. So I encourage people to attend our meetings and come.
Are the meetings online? Opinion. Okay.
Yes, they are.
Do you take public comments via the online portal? Okay. All right.
We do. And so we have, again, a standing item for public comment, but then when we actually come to an item itself, if somebody wants to talk about that, they could certainly ask.
Now, this extra meeting rooms and larger lobby and 24/7 and all that, I'm not sure I understand. Is that something that would be built as a beginning on the new site, or is that something that would be added to the guard site?
No, that would be built on the new site. Okay. And I want to throw in the element of affordable housing too. I think, again, this is all being considered, and it kind of goes back to after the bond election failed. We then had a couple of public meetings, and I think people were really clear on saying, look, we the public did not want to pay for a new library, with the major funding coming through a bond. But we're still interested in a new library. That has not gone away. So we're trying to say, okay, if there's still an interest in a new library, but with people don't want to pay for it through taxes, how do we do that? How do we manage that? And we're in negotiations with the San Juan Island Community Foundation, and we're in negotiations with the San Juan Island Home Trust to explore options for the use of that property.
Stand by just a second.
Okay.
Okay. All right. Is it true that the Orcas Library, which is a beautiful library, was not built with tax dollars?
That's correct. Boy, I sure envy them. I think that it's a gorgeous structure. It's a wonderful, wonderful library, great staff. And it was all, as far as I understood, it was all.
Does that enter into your calculus that there could be a private solution to the long-term San Juan Island Library?
Yes, and I think I think we as an island have some deep pockets that I think would really be interested in a new public library. But I will say that also, obviously, the current concern, one of the current concerns, is affordable housing. And I think we as a library board need to consider that. We've actually been approached by quite a few groups to see about affordable housing on that property. I will caution that we bought the property for a new library, and we as a board we can't go beyond our mission of being a library board. I mean, that's our mission, and that's what we have to stick with. We as a board cannot do the affordable housing as our own initiative. However, we are certainly interested in partnering with other organizations such as the Home Trust to figure out how to get there. Is it possible to have affordable housing on the property at the same time as reserving enough space for a new library?
So we've been sneaking up on this affordable housing angle. I'm not resisting that. I just wanted to lay some groundwork first. Let's start with, do you know the total acreage of the Spring Street site?
Yeah, it's about 2.5 acres.
It's so hard with Friday Harbor real estate to know. It's with the zigzags, exactly how big, or even the lines of a certain property. That's not very much, is it? 2.5 acres is not very much. When people start imagining 20 units or 40 units or 100 units or whatever it is. So 2.5 acres sounds like it's what would be needed for a library and a parking lot to me, right? So I'm not trying to say that I happen to think that this isn't about me, but I happen to think, just as a regular person, that affordable housing and library marries beautifully. I think it's a wonderful concept. Orcas Island is doing some great stuff with combining their family resource center and housing and senior center, all that. So sometimes there's some great synergies available, and certainly this would be one of those too. But we start with the reality of 2.5 acres, right?
Right.
Okay.
Yeah, you make a good point. And certainly when we bought the property, that's what we were thinking. We were thinking, oh my gosh, we could really have a full functional parking lot, great building, and just use it all ourselves. But I think we need to look at a spectrum here of affordable housing. And on one end, it says, okay, there's probably some property left over, part of the property left over at the back of the lot that could actually have several housing units there, and we could have the public library at the front of the property near the current site of the current building, and accommodate both. That's one end of the spectrum. And the other end of the spectrum is to say, okay, can we have a multi-use facility where, for instance, the library is on the ground floor, and then there's affordable housing on several stories above that, and then how many units can we get and things like that. This is, as I said, a spectrum. I think we really need to explore it all and see what the options are. What is the cutoff point where if you only have 1 or 2 affordable housing units, then is it really worth it? I mean, is it worth it to the home trust to look into that or not? And at the other end of the spectrum, when you get a multi-use building, you have to legally set it up so it's condominialized, and it legally gets very complex in terms of joint ownership of the property. So I guess what I'm saying is that the board, I think, is really open to a lot of ideas now, but we also explore how realistic they are, to say, okay, how is this going to be funded? How is it actually the structure going to work? How is it, if it's affordable housing, how will it be maintained as for affordable housing, and so on?
There are a lot of operational questions that come to mind, like if you have 10 or 20 units, that's 10 or 20 vehicles potentially that need to be parked, right? They're not all going to be able to be on the street. And they have, you have a residence, you might have visitors, they're going to be coming and going. Now you're looking at, I don't know, a lobby and hallways or things like that. I mean, I'm not trying to speak against any of this, but when you start to think about the reality of, now a 2 or 3 story building and people living in that same building, and then I mean, my gosh, look at the current library, how much activity, how much hustle and bustle and in and out of the front doors. This would be a even heavier traffic site if 10 or 20 people or families or individuals lived there and were coming and going. It would be a building that was really working, right? It would be a heavily used building. And how would it be funded? Would the library be gathering the funds to build the affordable housing, or is the home trust then getting the funds to build part of the building? How do you build one building with two purposes and two funding sources?
Yeah, you're bringing up many of the complexities of the situation, and I think that I know people are frustrated in terms of the pace of public action that way. We have affordable housing problem and people want to solve it now. I totally get that. But on the other hand, we as trustees, we are given the trust to actually manage those public funds in the public interest. And we have to be cautious and careful and deliberative in regard to that use. So while I say that I want to, we as a board want to explore all these options, I mean that by exploring it deeply and doing the due diligence for figuring out how that can happen. I know that one of the board members of the Home Trust was involved in a mutual building in West Seattle, and we're really curious about how that all worked. But you raise a whole bunch of questions, and for me, it comes back to what is the purpose of the Board of Trustees of the library, and that our purpose is the library. That's our primary priority, as opposed to the Home Trust, whose main purpose is affordable housing. So I see where we can meet and talk and try to figure out a mutual solution, but we are coming from different missions, and we have to be able to mesh that in order to make it work.
This is probably a hard question. It's a hard question to answer, and it's even a hard question to ask, but I'm going to give it a shot. How much of this is just the gravity, the size of the affordable housing problem in the San Juans? How much of it is just the fact that you're a public organization, you have a piece of land now, you even have a piece of land with a building that used to house people.
Right.
But if you were the fire department, or if you were the hospital, anybody that's building something right now, I think the public would probably start to think, maybe they could include some affordable housing since they're going to be having bulldozers and carpenters and all that. How much of it is that? And then how much of it is the fact that this did used to be a residential building, and it's every time you drive by, it's just like, gosh, there could be 20 people or 32 people living in there. I guess it's a little bit of both.
Yeah, I think it is a little bit of both. And again, I totally get it that people want to address that problem of affordable housing. But I will go back to, I think it's a little bit ironic in that I had heard that on the Argyle site, where the Home Trust is actually planning quite a few units, that there were discussions of having a mutual use facility with the county in terms of the county government and affordable housing. And I think it was ultimately rejected because it was too complicated. And so I don't want to, dismiss it right off the bat. I think we really, as I said, need to explore it. But I think a lot of that impulse is exactly what you said. People drive by and they say, here's an incredible resource. Why can't we use it? And the answer to that was nobody was about that sort of thing. They didn't want to buy the property for that purpose. And we bought it for the library. And so now we have the charge of investigating doing a new library there. And that's our responsibility.
Well, you've done a good job, I think, of explaining just how complicated and complex a deal like this would be. But I also don't hear you saying no. I don't hear you saying that the board is saying no. It's just something that is going to be difficult, very difficult.
Yes.
One last thing
Yeah.
we in our little chat yesterday, I wanted to touch on, and that is that in any kind of a multi-use building like this, you said that the library comes first. Do you want to talk about that a little bit in terms of design?
Yeah. So I think that let me go back to the actual choice of that site. I mean, obviously, we looked at the property next door to the existing building. We looked at the Argyle property, and we really settled on the Spring Street property for a number of reasons. One is that it's incredibly central, and we often talk about the library being a community center. I think that's and the center part of it is the center of the community is really important. It's within walking distance of all the major schools except for the elementary school. It's, it is centrally located. It's got greater parking. And I think that along with that goes the true visibility of that is that the library really, if it were a new library on that site, would be visually prominent in regard to the community itself. People driving down Spring Street would see it and realize that that's a library and that's a community center. So I think that aspect of it is really important. So when we're factoring in questions of, can we fit affordable housing in here and things like that, one of the things that I think that we really reject outright, but certainly have great doubt about, and that is to make the affordable housing front and center. I think really when you talk about the kind of order of things, it's the library that comes first and ought to be front and center, and in the affordable housing. And I think that's probably true of the affordable housing community itself too. I don't want to say take the back burner, but it would not be front and center in the same way that the library.
Well, so for people who are very intelligent and very have the greatest intentions and the greatest even support for the library, for people who might be looking at that building and saying, how could we take that building that's there right now and make all this work? I think I hear you saying, don't bother, because that's not in the cards. Is that a fair statement?
I think that is a fair statement. And I don't, again, I think we're open to suggestions. I mean, one of the proposals was to use that old building, and although we had that reaction to its design, I think we said, okay, show us the funding, show us how you're going to do this, and we'll seriously consider it. So I don't want to dismiss something, off the cuff, but I do want, if somebody's making a proposal, I do want it to be realistic and say, okay, how are you going to do this? And how are you going to accommodate the fact that it was purchased for the purpose of the library?
Well, you have invited the public to observe the meetings and give input and maybe follow this closer for some people. But what's kind of a timetable here? I mean, you're talking to the Community Foundation, right? And it sounds like you've got some direction or some belief now that this is going to be at least in this next step a private solution in terms of the $2 million plus. What's the timetable? I mean, are we going to hear something in a half a year or a year, or is something coalescing already? What can people that are really interested and concerned about this, what can they expect?
Well, I think that right now we have a 2-year window in which we really need to make some serious decisions in regard to the property itself. And one of those factors will be the actual final insurance settlement, which we hope to hear about possibly in spring of next year, if not mid-year. And I think that'll probably be generating a lot of the final, well, not the final, but the actual vision for the property itself and how it do it. So I would say look towards the middle of next year, and we'll certainly have I think a far better vision.
But that doesn't mean that you won't be talking about this at every meeting between now and then.
Absolutely, and that's certainly concurrent with trying to resolve the whole insurance issue. And I really thank you, Jeff, for emphasizing the public aspect of this. I don't want to, I can't emphasize enough that this is a public junior taxing district, and you guys make decisions on how you fund us. And thank you very much for doing the levy lid lift to keep our operations going. And this is a public discussion, and we intend to hear as many voices as possible.
Back to that insurance settlement, has the library received some of the funds, but like half or a
Yes.
portion? Well, you don't know because you don't know what the final will be, but is there a larger amount, and
Right.
could that be ultimately toward the 2 million? Go toward the 2 million?
Yes, and we're certainly hoping that will happen. We've received about $1.5 million, and the most of that has gone towards mitigation of the building itself. Again, removal of the asbestos and the stabilization of the building and things like that. Part of that is being held in reserve for the property itself. And we're currently seeking further funds in regard to that. And that is the big $64 question, or what is it, $64,000 question? But it's we're talking, more than that.
And is the asbestos mitigation completed? Okay.
It is, yes.
Well, Boyd, thank you so much for taking the time to answer these questions. I hope that people find that we bravely went into all the issues. If not, you'll certainly hear about it. I will too. Certainly meant to go to all of the questions and a few misunderstandings and the realities. We'll be talking also with the home trust people from their side. But I really appreciate your transparency and your quick willingness to do this interview. I didn't have to twist any arms, and I know you come here in faith as a public servant. So thank you so much. And this is Boyd Pratt. He is the president of the San Juan Island Library. Thank you, folks, and we will see you soon.
Thank you.